Hi, I'm Tony Northup, and this is a free 1-hour tutorial for the Nikon D5600. I'm gonna assume that you don't have previous experience with photography. If you already have some experience with cameras, you might wanna skip forward in this video. I make it easy. Check the description below for a table of contents that will allow you to click and jump forward to the parts of the video that you're interested in. If you want to see tutorials like this for other cameras, or maybe you have a friend who has a different type of camera, send them to this URL, sdp.io/tutorials, where we have free tutorials like this for just about every modern camera. Also, be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel. It's completely free, and you'll see the new videos that we put out. They're not just tutorials, but other fun stuff too. I'm not going to cover every aspect of this camera, specifically things like the kind of in-camera post-processing that you can do, like making black and white photos in camera. What I'm going to focus on are the things that I think are core to photography, but that does include kind of optional things like using wireless transfers and Snapbridge. So we'll cover just about everything. First up, the memory cards in this camera. Memory card, it has a single memory card, and I'm going to kind of physically orient you to the camera, but to get to the memory card, your digital film, you'll slide this little door back and it will pop open like that, and it takes an SD card. So when you get your SD card, you'll push it in there and it will click, and to release it, you'll push it again and it will kind of pop out like that. If you ever get an error that says you can't write to your SD card, it's because there's a little switch here on the side of the SD card, and you can see if it's down like that, it's locked. You can see lock is written there. So slide it up until it's unlocked if you do happen to see that error. Put it in, pull this door back, and then slide it closed like that. I suggest you get a couple of SD cards. Here's my technique for SD cards. I will buy one big, good SD card and keep it in the camera. I would suggest, if you can afford it, 128 gig SD card. That's a lot of space for a camera like this, but you will eventually fill it up, and it's nice to not ever run out of space. If you want to pick up an SD card, visit this URL, sdp.io/SD. You'll see my sdp.io links throughout this video. If you use them, I get a few pennies out of every dollar that you spend. Besides getting one big SD card, what I would do is look for cheap, inexpensive, like 8 gig SD cards, and then buy like 3 or 4 of them, and put one in your purse, put one in your car, put one in your office desk drawer, wherever you think you might be, because at some point in your career, you're going to forget a memory card, you're going to fill up a memory card, and then you can go back to those super cheap SD cards and put one in there, and it's way better than nothing. You can get those for like less than 10 bucks each. The way I suggest you get your pictures from your camera's memory card to your computer is by using an SD card reader. So visit this URL, sdp.io/SD reader, for my favorite one. It's USB 3, which will make those transfers much faster than they would be otherwise. Let's go over the battery on the camera. The battery is accessed through this door in the bottom. There's a little panel here. You'll pull that down and the door will flip open. Then you'll see the yellow switch. You'll pull that back and the battery will pop out. Putting the battery in, you just reverse that process. You'll look for the contacts there, put those in and towards the middle. So the battery will slide all the way in and it will latch in place like that, and then you can close the door. The battery doesn't last that long. You can't just take this on a week-long trip and expect the battery to last. So you either need to travel with a battery charger and charge it up every night. It can pretty much get through a regular day of shooting for the casual shooter. Or you need to get a couple of batteries. I definitely like to travel with at least one extra battery in my bag at all times, because you never know when you forget to charge it or it will just run out and you would hate to miss that shot. So here's a link to get another one of the original Nikon batteries, sdp.io/D5600 battery. You can find generic batteries for much cheaper, but we've tried just about all the different brands, and what we find is they work great for a month or 2 months. And then those generic batteries, the capacity on them drops off quickly. So you'll be using one of those generic batteries and then it will just suddenly stop. It'll go from 60% to just dead, and it will leave you stranded. And for that reason, I only recommend using the name brand batteries. I'm not afraid of using generic stuff. You'll see I recommend generic stuff all the time, including this non-Nikon battery charger. If you bring USB chargers with you, like to charge your phone or your smartwatch or some other USB device, we always have like half a dozen USB devices that we need to charge when we travel. This is terribly convenient. It will allow you to charge this Nikon battery with a USB charger. So visit that link to check that out. It's also smaller than the Nikon charger, so it'll just fit in your bag a little bit easier. Let's talk about the different ports on the camera. First up, the lens, and I'll talk about how to connect it. With a Nikon body, it'll come with a cover on the camera like that. You're going to look for the white dot on the lens mount there and line it up with the white dot on your lens. Line those two things up, and then you'll rotate the lens counterclockwise, opposite for most cameras, until it clicks. Then it's locked in place. Then I'll usually just wiggle it to make sure it stays in there perfectly. Before you can use this smaller kit lens, your camera might have come with one of two different kit lenses. If you have the smaller one, you'll need to unlock it first. You'll notice these are the focal lengths written on the barrel here, 18 to 55. If it's on L, see the little white dot there? You'll need to push this button in and then twist it until it unlocks. When it unlocks, you'll hear it click, and then you won't be able to go all the way back. If you want to lock it again, push that in and twist it all the way back to L. That just makes the lens smaller, so it's a little bit easier to transport. I like that feature of this lens a lot. While I'm talking about the lens, I'll show you a couple switches that are on it. You'll see VR here. It's either on or off. You'll pretty much always want to leave that on for this. You don't need to turn it off for things like tripods. VR is vibration reduction. It just, if you have a little bit of shaky hands or you're doing a long exposure handheld, it'll smooth those out. It just helps you get sharp shots, especially in low light conditions. The other switch here is either autofocus or manual focus, and almost all the time you're going to leave it in A for autofocus. If for some reason you decide you need to manual focus, you can switch it over to M. In order to manually focus, you'll twist this outer ring here to focus. But the autofocus is great on this camera. There's not too many reasons you need to manually focus. There are a few other ports you should know about on the camera. If we go over to the left side here, you'll see a rubber gasket. We can flip that out, and you'll see 3 ports on the inside. The first is for a remote shutter trigger. That remote shutter trigger allows you to trigger the camera without actually touching the camera, and there's not too many reasons that you need to do that with this particular camera, but if you are interested in a remote shutter trigger, here's the model that I recommend, sdp.io/D5600 trigger. I do not recommend buying the Nikon version because it's very expensive. These generic ones do great, and they're like usually less than 20 bucks. So don't spend more than 20 bucks. The next port underneath this little rubber gasket here is the microphone port. If you want to use an external microphone like the one I'm talking into now, that will greatly improve the sound quality of any sorts of recordings that you make. This camera does have an on-camera microphone, but the sound's pretty much always going to be bad. The bottom port here is a USB port. You cannot use that for USB charging the battery. Unfortunately, you can only use it for transferring files off of the camera's memory card. So you don't necessarily need a memory card reader, and if you're ever caught without a memory card reader, you can hook up a USB, it looks like a micro USB, into that and then into your computer and unload those pictures. But I find just using a memory card reader to be much, much more convenient. There's also a port on the right side of the camera here, a little gasket over here, right above the memory card reader. When you flip that open, this is a mini HDMI port. You'll probably never use that. It will allow you to hook it up to a TV and kind of play your pictures back in case, I don't know, you were in a hotel room and you wanted to show off all your pictures, but realistically, it's not a common way that people consume pictures. Slideshows are a little bit outdated, but that's what that port is. It's an option for you if you ever want to do that. Let's move on and start talking about how to actually take a picture. Before taking a picture, turn your camera on by twisting the on-off button from off to on. It's right on the shutter there. And with this camera, you don't really have to sweat turning it off. You can pretty much just leave it on all the time. When you get your camera, it's going to be in this green auto mode here. That's okay, but we're going to get you out of that green auto mode because it will automatically do a bunch of annoying things for you, like turn your flash on when you don't necessarily want it, and it also prevents the number of options that you'll see, so it limits the menus that you'll get. So right away, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put it into P mode, program mode. Everything's still automatic in program mode, but it gives you more options to make decisions. Another thing you want to do is to flip your screen back around, because when you get the camera, you probably have the screen protected like that, so you have the hard outer surface there. You'll flip that out, twist it 180, and then flip it back, and now you'll be able to see things on the back of the screen. That's really important. When you're ready to take a picture, by default, all you have to do is push the shutter halfway until it focuses. It'll beep. Oh, see, I got to make sure. See, it says lens retracted here. That just means I got to unlock it. So I'll click that out. There we go. Now when I push the shutter halfway, You can hear it beep. Now I'll push it all the way. So the shutter button is kind of 2 stages, halfway until it focuses and then all the way until it actually takes a picture. Notice that it just took 1 picture. That's just the way the camera is set up now. Hit the play button to review your last picture. This camera has a touchscreen. So if you want to zoom in, you can do it just like your smartphone. You can pull in like that. And that's a really handy way to make sure that you nailed the focus. If you're taking a group photo, do that, zoom in, and then kind of look at everybody's eyes and make sure that everybody's in focus and nice and sharp. You can also hit the I button here, and that'll bring up this little menu here, which gives you the option to select the rating. If you scroll to the right with rating selected, you can select a number of stars. Let me tell you why that's useful. If you use an app like Adobe Lightroom to organize your pictures, when you import your pictures into your computer and into Lightroom, the number of stars that you select will show up in there. So let's say you're shooting, you take 200 pictures in a day, but while you're at lunch, you flip through and you find one picture that's really good, you can rate it 5 stars. And then when you get back into Lightroom, you'll be able to find that one picture without going through all 200 pictures that you took that day. So if you are looking through the pictures on the back of the camera, find one that's good, go ahead and give it a rating like 3 to 5 stars, and that'll just make life easier for you when you're back at your computer. If you want to see something like the histogram, the f-stop, etc., for a particular picture, you'll need to go into the menu here. So this button up here in the upper left, menu. I'm going to hit that, and you'll see this set of 6 different kind of tabs, different options, and we're going to pick the top one up here, the little playback one, and then we're going to go down to the 3rd option, playback display options. And now this shows you the different types of views for playback images that you can select from. So I'm just going to highlight each of these and then select all of them so I can show you the differences. So now all those are selected. I'm going to hit OK down here, and let's go back and hit the play button again. Now if I want to iterate through those different views, I'll push up on the directional pad. Pushing up once cleared all the information, so I see only my picture. If I push it up again, now I'm seeing all the metadata for the image, like the shutter speed and the f-stop and the ISO, as well as my histogram. Histogram, really, really terribly useful. And if you search my channel, you'll find the video that tells you exactly how to use a histogram. You can also find it in chapter 4 of my book, Stunning Digital Photography. So I'll push up again, and now you can see it's just providing an alternate view. This one's not as useful because I've already seen that. And if I keep going, I'll see that RGB histogram. I usually just use the regular luminance histogram without worrying about the RGB histogram. It's not that important. If you don't want to iterate through all of those, you can go in and turn off those that you don't really need. Like I don't need the none or the RGB histogram, but the rest of those should be okay. Just be sure to click OK afterwards rather than just going back. Now let's talk about using live view. The main way you'll use this camera is with what they call the optical viewfinder up here. You'll hold this up to your eye and you'll look through it, and when it focuses, you'll be able to see things highlighted. That's not an electronic display like on your smartphone. It's an optical viewfinder. It's literally lights coming through the lens and then hitting that mirror there, and then it's bouncing up here into a prism and over to your eye. So you're seeing stuff in just real time. It's old-timey tech, a mirror and a prism. But that allows you to see things instantly with no delay, and it also gives the camera the best possible focusing speed. Stuff focuses very, very quickly when you have your eye up to the viewfinder. The other option is live view, which works exactly like when you take a picture with your smartphone. It's this display on the back. So if you want to use that, what you'll do is there's this switch here up next to the bone dial. See how it says LV? I'll pull that towards me. You hear that mirror flip up out of the way because now the camera is using that sensor, and it's going to show you what you see through the lens on the back of the camera. Live view on this camera is tremendously useful because it's got this flippy screen. So I can flip this out, and this means that I could hold it over my head and tilt the screen down like that and see over a crowd. Or if I wanted to take a picture low to the ground for an interesting composition, I could hold it like this without having to lay on my belly. Another thing it's useful for is you can flip it towards you and flip it around and take a selfie. Or you could record yourself on video and just monitor it to make sure you don't walk out of the frame. Live view on this camera, really, really useful. You can also touch the screen to focus it. So there you go. See it? I touched it, it focused it, and then it actually took a picture for me. So it's an experience not too unlike using your smartphone. Just like when you're reviewing images, you can hit the info button up here to change the view that you see on the screen. So I could clear all the data off of the screen. I could put a grid there, which is useful for composing along with the rule of thirds. You'll learn about that in chapter 2 of my book, Stunning Digital Photography. I'll hit the info button again and just see different types of information, including like what the current shutter speed is, the f-stop, the ISO, how many shots I have remaining, the battery capacity, and a few other things. If you don't like that touchscreen interaction, there's this option here. See, it's got a little finger with like an exploding finger. If I touch that, I turn off touch shutter. So now it will focus without actually taking a picture, or I can touch it again to turn it back on. That's the difference. Now let's talk about how to adjust the brightness of live view. For the most part, the default's probably fine, but maybe you get out in the sun and you wish it were a little brighter. Hit the menu button here, go down to the wrench icon, and then on the first page here, you'll see the option for monitor brightness, the last one down here. So I'll scroll to the right, and now I can go up and make the screen much brighter, or I could go down and make it dimmer and save myself a little bit of battery life. Of course, brighter screens use more battery power, so you might not want to do that unless you are struggling with the brightness. If you're using the optical viewfinder here, you should be aware of the diopter. The diopter here is like dialing in a contact lens or glasses prescription into the viewfinder, which is great if you don't have perfect vision. Even if you do have perfect vision, you need to be aware of it though, because this diopter can get hit accidentally, and then you'll go to look through it and it'll be like wearing somebody else's glasses, like the whole world will be all blurry and messed up. So you might think your camera's not focusing when it's actually just the diopter's out of place. To set the diopter correctly, hold the camera up to your eye and hit the shutter button so it wakes up, and then don't look through the lens. Look at the numbers at the bottom of the screen and twist that diopter until they're as sharp as possible. Better here, better here. There you go. And when everything is as sharp as possible, it's set. If you're switching the camera between a couple of different people, the diopter, you might need it in different places for different people. Let's talk about the different camera modes. Up until now, I've been just using P mode, which is program mode, and that's like basically a full auto mode without artificial limitations. But most of the time when I'm doing my day-to-day shooting, I'm using Aperture Priority mode, and that's marked with an A here. So I'm going to take the mode dial and switch it over to Aperture Priority mode. Here's what Aperture does. It does two things. The aperture is an opening in the lens, just like the iris of your eye. So it can open up big and let in lots of light, or it can close down small and let in less and less light. You can imagine if you're shooting low light, you're probably going to want it nice and big, right? If you're out in the sun, there might be times when you want to make it nice and small to let in less light. Here's a diagram of what different f-stops look like inside of a lens. This is actually a figure from my book. You can see different f-stops. It's counterintuitive. F2, a small number, has a big opening, and F32, a big number, has a small opening. It's confusing. I didn't make these rules up. This is just the way photography is. It makes a little more sense if you understand fractions. Look at the way it's written, F/32. Think of the number as being in the denominator of the fraction. Therefore, 1/32 is smaller than 1/2, right? That makes a little bit more sense if that helps you think about it. Besides controlling the amount of light that is let into the lens, the aperture changes what we call the depth of field, or the background blur of an image. So these pictures were taken with an 85mm lens at 3 different f-stops. On the left, you see f1.8. The background is very, very blurry, which changes more than, it changes the story of the image too. With the blurry background, all you see is Chelsea there. The viewer's gaze is focused only on the subject, and everything else becomes abstracted. With higher f-stop numbers like f8, the background becomes more and more in focus, and now we have more context. It's not just Chelsea's face, but it's Chelsea's face in a New York City environment, in an alley. And then if we get all the way up to f22, suddenly everything is sharp. We don't just get the impression of there being an alley, but we can see individual people. We can make out features of cars. it adds much more context, much more story, but at the same time, many more distractions away from the main subject. So as a photographer, you get to choose the f-stop number, and that's part of the creative control that you get. For detailed information about how to use Aperture and f-stop numbers, visit this URL for another free video, sdp.io/fstop. It's just another video on our channel. It's completely free. To control your aperture, of course, you'll be in Aperture Priority mode, as I showed you. And I'm just going to make sure the camera's awake. As we look at the back of the screen here, it's showing me 3 different settings: the shutter speed on the left, the aperture in the middle, and the ISO on the right. So I can easily change the aperture in Aperture Priority mode by using the main dial here. This is the main dial underneath your thumb. If I twist it to the right, you can see the f-stop number gets higher and higher. And it's actually visually showing me what the aperture looks like. It's getting smaller and smaller. If I scroll to the left, the f number gets smaller. Now you can see if I scroll to the left, it won't go lower than f/5.6. That's because this lens is an f/5.6 lens. You can actually look on the front here and see it says 18 to 55, f3.5 to f/5.6. There's 2 different ranges there. At 18 millimeters, the minimum f-stop number is f3.5. At 55 millimeters, the minimum f-stop number is f5.6. I'm at 55 right now, which means I can't go below f5.6. If I zoom back to 18, suddenly I can scroll down and go all the way to f3.5. Different lenses will allow you to select lower f-stop numbers. For example, if you pick up this wonderful 50 millimeter f1.8 and put it on there, you'll be able to go select an f-stop number all the way down to f1.8, which will give you more low light gathering capability, which will give you more light gathering capabilities in low light and allow you to blur the background more. So you are kind of limited to the f-stop range that your particular lens supports. If, for whatever reason, you just prefer using the touchscreen, you'll see the little left and right arrow there. You can select that and just go up or down. But it's kind of better if you get used to using the main dial. It's just easier to use. Let's go on and talk about shutter priority. While the aperture controls the amount of light that comes in by opening and closing the iris, the shutter controls the amount of light that enters the camera by determining how long that shutter opens up. The shutter is more like your eyelids of your eyes. So when the shutter's closed, which is most of the time, it'll open when you take a picture and stay open for the amount of time that it determines it needs to gather the right amount of light, and then it closes again. If you're in aperture priority mode, the camera will just take care of that for you automatically and determine, it'll look at the scene and be like, oh, it's pretty bright, I don't need to have the shutter open that long. But if you decide you want to take control of the shutter, what you'll do is you'll move this main dial over to, the mode dial over to S, and then you'll move the main dial up or down. You can see now it's at 1/4 of a second. I can go all the way down to 1 full second. That's what 1 quote mark means. Or I can keep going to the left and do like a 30-second exposure. The only reason you do a 30-second exposure is if you were taking pictures at night, maybe of stars, and you have the camera on a tripod to keep it from shaking around. Most of the time, you're going to be in the range of like 1/60th of a second, 1/30th of a second. 1/30th is okay for like still portraits if you're in a dim environment. Though for most part, I'd rather be taking portraits at 1/60th. If you're taking pictures of active kids, you probably want to be at 1/125th or 1/250th. 1/250th is good for kids sports too, but if you get into like middle school, high school sports, sometimes you need to go a little faster, go up to like 1/500th. And if you get into wildlife photography, things like flying birds, you'll probably want to be at like 1/1600th, 1/2000th, or even 1/2500th. You probably don't need to often go above that, but if you're taking pictures of hummingbirds maybe and you want to freeze those wings, you could get up to a full maximum shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second. Just as before, you can adjust the shutter speed by using the touchscreen if you so choose, but again, that main dial really is much, much easier to use. Now, both the shutter speed and the aperture separately control the amount of light that's entering the camera. So in aperture priority, you control the aperture, the camera controls the shutter speed. In shutter priority, you control the shutter speed, the camera controls the aperture. So those two things kind of balance. Controlling shutter is a key part of storytelling in photography, and it's a creative choice that you as a photographer have. Here's 3 pictures of my daughter as a sample. We're both on one of those spinny merry-go-round things, and I'm facing her. So at 1/8 of a second, we're both spinning at the same speed in all these pictures, but at 1/8 of a second, you can see the background is nice and blurred because we're moving. She remains still because she's moving at the same speed as me. This tells a story. It tells a story that we're on a merry-go-round and spinning. If I increase that shutter speed, if I make it faster and go to 1/30th of a second, you can see the background still visibly moving, but it's not moving as much. It's not as nicely blurred. If I go all the way up to 1/125th of a second, it no longer looks like we're moving, but we are. You just can't see it anymore. That's the creative storytelling. You can see if the camera chose, if I let the camera decide, it probably would have chosen 1/125th or faster. And you never would have known what we were doing. You wouldn't even know we were on a merry-go-round at all. So that's the kind of thing that you need to think about as a photographer, the shutter speed that you want to select in order to best tell the story. I describe how to select that right shutter speed in detail in chapter 4 of my book, Stunning Digital Photography. You can also get a free video here at sdp.io/settings that should be a big help. Now, what if you want to control both the shutter speed and the aperture at the same time? That's what manual mode is for. Select manual mode by setting the mode dial to M. Now, if we bring up the screen here, you can see we can adjust the shutter speed by using the main dial, just like we did in shutter priority mode. If we want to adjust the aperture, we're going to hold down this plus or minus button here, right next to the shutter. So you'll hold that down, and then you'll move the main dial. So release it to adjust the shutter speed, hold it down to adjust the aperture. Alternatively, of course, you can use the touchscreen and adjust those up or down independently. Now, manual mode gets to be a little more complex because you're taking more complete control over those 2 factors. So you don't necessarily need to dive right into it. Get comfortable controlling one or the other and what those effects are before you decide that you're going to control both at the same time. However, manual mode, I do have a straightforward process for using manual mode with great success. Check out this video, sdp.io/go manual. If you want to check these different videos out later, I know I'm branching out in a lot of different directions. Check the description down below. You'll find links to all of these. And also be sure to subscribe to see more free videos as we release them. I'm just going to take a minute and talk about my books. Buying these books supports us and makes these sorts of tutorials possible to provide for free. Our book, Stunning Digital Photography, is the best-selling photography book in the world. And it's not just a book, but it's a video book. It includes over 14 hours of videos of this type of quality, and some of them even better than this, that will help you learn photography even if you don't love reading. So you can read the book and learn that way, or you can just watch the videos. But for the best results, I like to read and then watch a little video. And the way it works is I'll have a section written about choosing the right shutter speed, and then there'll be a video that you can watch about shutter speed. So you kind of get to learn it in 2 different ways, and especially for visual learners, it helps them learn efficiently, quickly, and effectively. We find that people just learn and retain that information much better. In addition to the videos, there's a free Facebook group that you can join. It's a private group only for people reading the book, but it actually has over 20,000 people in the group now. And they're all going through the learning process, and they're extremely helpful and supportive. So you get access to that group. So people will answer your questions. You can post pictures and they'll give you feedback on your pictures. It's just a really great group and a good part of learning photography, especially if you're a social person. Every chapter has practices at the end of it where you'll pick up your camera and you'll go out and you'll do those things, and that will help you learn. There's also quizzes, optional quizzes. They're unscored, but by taking these quizzes, the questions are designed to make you think about what you've just read and watched. And again, I've found that that helps people retain that information over the long term. If you get the electronic version of the book, the ebook, which you can read on your computer or an iPad or your smartphone, it's only $10. The paperback version is about $20. You can go to Amazon and search for Stunning Digital Photography or my name, Tony Northup, and check out the reviews. You can buy it directly from Amazon, or you can go to sdp.io/store. That's our own store. We ship this stuff worldwide, and you'll get instant access to it. If you already have SDP or you're good at photography and you get into post-processing, I also have books on Adobe Lightroom, which is great for organizing your pictures and doing lighter editing, and a book on Adobe Photoshop, which is like seriously what every pro uses to get the maximum amount of editing done and get the most perfect pictures possible. So we have books on those. If you're baffled by which lens and camera to buy for different situations like portraits and sports, or if you want to get studio lighting for professional portraiture, check out my photography buying guide. Again, the ebook versions are all $10. The paperbacks are a little bit more, but you have both those options. I'm just going to throw out a few links here for you to explore in case you wanted to dive deeper into different genres of photography. If you want to check out night photography, taking pictures at night, visit sdp.io/np. If you want to get into landscape photography, sdp.io/ls. Wildlife photography, sdp.io/wl. Now we'll get into bulb mode, which actually comes up a lot in night photography. Bulb mode is this, the term comes from the old film days where you would actually use a bulb that was a shutter trigger, and you could kind of lock the bulb down and that would lock the shutter open. But we don't have to use a bulb anymore. It's still called bulb mode generically though. And what bulb mode does is allows you to keep the shutter open longer than 30 seconds. So I'm still in manual mode. If I scroll this all the way to the left, you'll see the maximum shutter speed I can select is 30 seconds. So what if I need to take a 60-second exposure? I could scroll to the left one more time and select bulb mode. Now in bulb mode, the shutter stays open as long as you hold your finger down on the shutter. So if I hold it down for 1 second, I make a 1 second exposure. You can see it's blurry and shaky and too bright. Or I could hold my finger there for 1 full minute and keep that shutter locked open. You probably wouldn't want to hold your finger there for a minute because you'd shake the camera. So a better thing to do is to use that remote shutter trigger that I suggested before and hook it up here and then lock it open with that remote shutter trigger. But while I cover that for completeness, you actually don't have to do that on this camera because this camera has timer mode. So I'm on bulb now in manual mode. If I scroll one more time to time, in time mode, the camera will keep the shutter open until you push the shutter a second time. So you don't have to hold your finger on there. You push it once, it opens the shutter. And now you could look at your watch or set a reminder in your phone, like remind me to turn the, hey Siri, set an alarm for 2 minutes. And then after 2 minutes, you can come back and just push that shutter again and it will close it. So you don't have to. Siri was actually listening to me there. That's funny, see? Siri's on the ball. Another option for using the shutter is to use a self-timer. So there are a couple of reasons you might want to use a self-timer. You might be taking a selfie with your family and you'll set the camera up on a tripod and you'll flip that screen around and then you'll hit the shutter and you'll run behind your family and put your arm around them. To use the self-timer, what you'll do is there's a button on the front here. See it looks like a stack of copies and then this little clock icon. You'll push that. And now you'll be able to select the self-timer here. You can see this one is set to 10 seconds. So I'll select that, and now it's a 10-second self-timer. So if I hit that button, it's going to beep like that for 10 seconds. It'll change its pace as it gets near the end. And then finally, after 10 seconds, click. Now, the 10-second self-timer is good for putting your arm around your family. You can also select a shorter self-timer if you have the camera on a tripod and you want to eliminate the camera shake that you get by actually pushing the shutter. It's common in macro photography where you take close-up pictures or night photography where you have to use a long shutter speed. So this will just make your pictures a little sharper if you use this type of self-timer. So I'll hit the menu button here. It doesn't need to be 10 seconds. If you're doing that, it only needs to be like 2 seconds. So I'll set it to a shorter self-timer so I don't have to stand there for 10 seconds. With the pencil icon selected in the menus, I'll scroll down to C, timers, /AE lock, and then go down to C3. I'll scroll to the right, and you can see self-timer delay. I can just set that to 2 seconds. So again, 10 seconds for putting your arm around your family, or 2 seconds for eliminating camera shake when you're using the camera on a tripod. Now with that set to 2 seconds, I can hit this timer button up here, and you can see if I do select self-timer, it's the 2-second variety rather than the 10-second variety. Now let's talk about the different shutter modes that you can choose from. By default, when you push the shutter all the way, it's going to take one picture. And even if I hold it down, it's still only going to take that one picture. If you're shooting sports, you probably want to take a picture as fast as possible, and trying to take pictures like that would be just way too slow. In those cases, you'll select a continuous shutter mode. It's going to be this button on the front here with the stack of copies like that. So you push that, and then you'll get this option, and you can see either L or H. L is for low speed continuous, or H is for high speed continuous. And on this camera, the H is probably all you'll ever need to use because it's not too fast for you. Now with high speed continuous selected, if I hold down the shutter button, it'll focus. And then continuously take pictures like that. Now you'll notice that the pacing is a little weird. It took a few pictures continuously and then it slowed down. That's a process called buffering, where it's trying to write the pictures to the memory card, but the memory card's not accepting the pictures as fast as it can write them. So it's kind of like, oh, I need to wait until more space is freed up. And that's why it will kind of delay like that. You can reduce that amount of buffering by buying a faster memory card. You'll see memory cards come in different speeds, and generally higher speeds will have less buffering. However, it's also dependent on the camera, so you'll never completely get rid of that buffering no matter how much you spend on a memory card. For me, I always leave the camera in continuous shutter because even if I'm taking a portrait of somebody standing still, I like to rattle off 3 or 4 pictures because of micro expressions. People's expression can change from moment to moment, from being more of a genuine smile to a little bit of an uncomfortable smile, or they might just happen to blink and you can't really time a picture around a blink because you can't even necessarily see it when you're holding up your eye up to the viewfinder. So you rattle off 3 or 4 pictures. Pictures are free in the digital world, and you'll delete all but the best one. That's why I like to use the continuous high speed mode all the time. Focusing also has different modes. By default, the camera will try to figure out whether you're focusing on a still subject or a moving subject, but you're smarter than the camera. You should tell it whether the subject is still or moving by changing the different focusing modes. And I'll show you how to do that now. The easiest way to do this is to bring the screen up, and then I'll hit the I button here. And near the lower left corner, right now it's set to AFA. I'll touch that, and now I can select the different focusing modes. AFA is the default. It's AF automatic, where the camera is thinking about stuff. If I'm shooting a still subject, I'll select, went away on me, I'll select AFS for still subject, single focus. Or I'll select AFC for continuous focusing mode. With continuous focusing mode, the camera doesn't focus quite as precisely. However, if the subject is moving, like it is for sports or wildlife usually, it will track that movement. So AFC is pretty good on this camera. You shouldn't run into any problems, and if you always leave it on AFC, you'll probably still get pretty good results, but AFS is going to be a little more accurate for still subjects. For more information about which focusing mode to choose, visit this free video here at sdp.io/focus. You can also select from different focusing areas. So by default, when you look through the viewfinder and you focus on something, the camera might focus anywhere in the viewfinder, all the way out towards the edges of the screen. And that can work really well for you. Sometimes, however, it might focus on the wrong thing. It might decide to focus on a branch rather than the bird. Or it might focus on the wrong person in a group of people. Because of that, I almost always choose a single focusing point and then choose where I'm going to focus in the frame rather than letting the camera decide. It's one of those differences between an absolute beginner and somebody with even just a little more experience is you'll select that focusing point manually. To select your own focusing point, I find the easiest thing to do on this camera is to again hit this I button. And now, if you can select this option here, it's right next to the AF focusing. And by default, the AF area mode is selected where it will choose for you. What I prefer is this single focusing point, single point AF. Now it's going to focus on one spot exactly where I tell it. And as I hold my eye up to the viewfinder, I'm going to use the directional pad here to select my focusing point. So you'll see that red box just move around. You'll put it right on the closest eye of a picture you're taking, a person you're taking a portrait of. Same thing applies for wildlife. You'll put it on the nearest eye. It'll just help you nail focus. Another option that you have in that focusing areas setting here is 3D. 3D tracking is really good for sports. I love Nikon's 3D tracking. So if you are tracking people, you'll set the focusing to AFC, and then you'll set the AF area mode to 3D tracking. Again, when you're done, you probably want to go back to the single focusing mode. The way 3D focusing mode works is it still uses a single focusing point. However, if you have it on continuous and you continue to hold your finger down on the shutter button and that person moves through the frame, it will track them as they move across different focusing points. So that's the difference between using a single focusing point and 3D tracking mode, is 3D tracking mode will track somebody as they move across the frame without requiring you to select a different focusing point. Back button focusing is a technique, it's a more advanced technique, but if you're shooting a mix of still subjects and moving subjects, it can be tremendously useful. Now, if you read Stunning Digital Photography, you'll see I'll discuss a compositional technique called focus and recompose. With focus and recompose, you can focus on a subject and have that focus point be up in a corner of a frame where the camera can't automatically focus. So basically, it allows you to focus anywhere in the frame. You'll focus, hold the shutter button down halfway, and then move, recompose the shot before you take it. That way you can focus even if the camera doesn't have a focusing point in that part of the picture. Back button focus allows you to use the focus and recompose technique while using continuous shutter. So you never have to switch between single focus and continuous focus. Back button focus is also terribly useful for things like night photography, where you might prefer to manually focus, but you don't want to have the camera ruin your focus every time you push the shutter button. What back button focusing does is it separates the shutter button from the action of focusing. So when you push the shutter button halfway, the camera will no longer focus for you. If you want to actually focus, you'll push this button up here. Now, if I haven't thoroughly explained why you might want to use back button focus, if it's not making sense to you, visit this URL, sdp.io/YBB, where I have a more detailed explanation of why back button focusing is useful. But it is a more advanced technique. Don't feel like you need to try it out day one. After you've had the camera for a month, come back, revisit this, and try it out, because I promise everybody, almost everybody who uses back button focus sticks with it, because it is a really helpful technique. To enable back button focusing on this camera, I'm going to hit the menu button here. Then I'm going to go to the pencil icon, and I'm going to go down to F, Controls, and then F2, Assign AEL AFL button. I'll scroll to the right, and I'm going to set this to AF on. That's all I have to do. So now, if I push the shutter button halfway, I'll turn on live view here. If I push the shutter button halfway, the camera does nothing. It will still take a picture if I push it all the way. If I want to focus, I'll hit that AEL button, and you can see it snaps into focus. So now the camera never autofocuses unless I explicitly tell it to. That's really, really helpful. But in order to autofocus, I need to coordinate the use of my thumb here to focus and my index finger to take a picture. So now you just have both your thumb and your index finger working instead of just your index finger, but you have that extra degree of control. Check it out, sdp.io/YBB. Besides aperture and shutter speed, the third factor that controls the brightness of your pictures is ISO. It is pronounced ISO, it's not ISO, and if you want more information about it, visit sdp.io/ISO. In a nutshell, ISO controls the relative sensitivity of your sensor. So in a dim environment, you would use a high ISO to make your sensor really sensitive to that dim light. Or if you were outside in bright sun, you use a low ISO to reduce that sensitivity. At lower ISOs, the camera's pictures will be much cleaner. You won't see any of that like digital grain, the noise. If you use a high ISO, like ISO 6400, you'll see a lot of that noise and your pictures will look less sharp and maybe a little bit uglier. So it's always beneficial to use a lower ISO, provided you can still get a fast enough shutter speed to prevent camera shake or motion blur. To change the ISO, it's oddly a little bit difficult to change on the camera by default. But let's get out of live view here and we'll pull up the screen. You can see it's at ISO 100 now. There is a function button on this camera that will allow you to change it easily. As we look on the left here, you see FN. I can hold that down and then adjust the main dial here to change the ISO to whatever I want. All the way down to a low ISO of ISO 100, where I'll get the cleanest pictures, all the way up to ISO 25600, where I'll be able to take pictures in very dim light, but my pictures will have a lot of noise. All these settings right now are manual ISO, so the camera will not automatically change the ISO if you're in these modes by default. If you were in the green auto mode, it would automatically change the ISO for you. If you want to set auto ISO, which is a great thing to do, I almost always use auto ISO. What you'll do is you'll go into the menu system here. You'll go to the camera icon, and then right at the bottom here, ISO sensitivity settings. I'll touch that, and see auto ISO sensitivity control. I'll just set that to on. So that's one of the first things I would do on this camera, is just set auto ISO sensitivity control to on, because it's just my personal preference. I would rather have the camera take care of that and use manual mode to allow me to think about the shutter speed and aperture while still allowing the camera to change the ISO to get automatic exposure. It's a useful technique. Another really important thing to know about your camera is how to use exposure compensation. Exposure compensation controls the brightness of the overall image. So let's switch into live view here. And you can see as I look at the screen here, the screen's a little bit gray, but I want it to be bright white. So that means the camera's auto exposure system is underexposing the image. I want it to be brighter. So what I'll do is hold down this plus or minus button. So you can see as I keep scrolling to the right, the screen gets brighter and brighter. And if I scroll to the left, it gets darker and darker. That's just a real-time preview. Now you won't see a difference in brightness when you're using the optical viewfinder like this, because that's just looking directly through the lens. It can't change that. You will only see that difference in brightness when you're using live view. However, you will see the difference when you actually take the picture, even if you're using the viewfinder. So if you're using the viewfinder, be sure to review your pictures by hitting the play button, and then determine whether or not you need to retake the picture with or without exposure compensation. So by holding this down in either program, shutter, or aperture priority mode, doesn't work the same way in manual mode, I can adjust that exposure to get the amount of brightness that I really want. When I'm done with that, after I've taken my picture, I always want to go back and set the exposure compensation back to 0. That way the next time I pick up the camera, I won't be overexposing all my pictures without happening to notice it. So do remember to go back and reset it when you're done. For detailed information about using exposure compensation, visit sdp.io/EC. Bracketing is a technique that comes from the days of film. Photographers didn't used to be able to review their pictures instantly, so they would never quite be sure if they were nailing the exposure, or maybe they were underexposing it or overexposing it. So what they would do is use bracketing to take 3 pictures. They'd take a picture at what they thought was the right exposure, then they would take a picture that was underexposed and overexposed. And when they got back to the photo lab, they could decide which of those 3 pictures was best. You can still use bracketing. It's not as important nowadays because you can review your picture in real time and then make adjustments and retake it. However, bracketing is an important technique if you want to shoot HDR photos, high dynamic range photos, either for artistic purposes or to reduce the amount of noise in your images, even in challenging dynamic range situations. I have a whole chapter on HDR in my book, Stunning Digital Photography, if you want to know more about it, but I will show you how to set it on this camera. To turn on bracketing, I'll push the I button here to bring up this menu, and then I can scroll down to first row, third column, BKT. That's the international abbreviation for bracketing. So I'll select that, and then I can choose, usually what I'll choose is AE 2.0. That's the only option you probably need. I'll select that. So now when I take a picture, instead of taking 1 picture, I'm going to take 3 pictures. And you can see what it did was it took 1 picture at what it thought was the proper exposure, 1 picture 2 stops underexposed, and 1 picture 2 stops overexposed. It bracketed. Again, I can combine those later on my computer to get like a perfectly clear and clean image, or I could just pick the exposure that happened to be the best one. Bracketing is another one of those things that you want to turn off when you're done, so I'll hit that I button and then reset it back to off. Otherwise, the next time you go to take a picture, it's going to be changing the exposure all over the place for you, and that's going to be really confusing. I suggest that everybody change their camera from shooting JPEG to shooting RAW. Let's talk a little bit about what those formats are. JPEG is the file format that pictures are used on the web. And anytime you share a picture, it's probably going to be in JPEG. So whatever site you're on, if you're looking at pictures, they're probably JPEG pictures. JPEG is this highly compressed format that makes it easy to send across the internet. But JPEG files throw away a lot of the scene, especially details that are in shadows or bright highlights. If you ever get into editing your photos, or you think you might in the future want to go back and edit the photos that you're taking now, shooting RAW gives you a lot more flexibility. It allows you to produce cleaner images and will allow you to fix the exposure at your computer. In other words, if I accidentally overexpose or underexpose a picture, I can probably fix it later. It's an amazing and powerful technique. And it's so powerful, in fact, just about every pro in the world shoots RAW, but it's not enabled by default. If you want to know more about why you should use RAW, visit this URL, sdp.io/rawvjpeg. I'm just going to show you how to turn it on. Hit the menu button here, go to the camera icon, and then right on the first page, it's so important they put it right on the first page, you'll select image quality. And here you can select between various combinations of RAW and JPEG. If you just want to shoot RAW, if you already know how to use it, and you have an application like Adobe Lightroom that will process those RAW files, just select NEF RAW. NEF is the file extension. Your pictures will have a .NEF file extension. If you're not sure about RAW, but you think you might want it, you could choose to shoot both RAW and JPEG files. For that, I would select NEF RAW plus JPEG, fine, and select that. So now every time you take a picture, the camera is actually going to save two versions of it, one in JPEG and one in RAW. That way you can use the JPEG and share it if that's what you're comfortable with. And then later, when maybe you get Adobe Lightroom and you start processing and organizing your images, you could still benefit from the quality of those RAW files. Again, RAW files let you fix mistakes later. And as a beginner, that can be tremendously useful. So I do suggest you take some time and check it out. Let's talk a little bit about metering modes, more as a technicality than anything else. I tell everybody, don't even sweat metering modes. So go ahead and skip to the next section if you want. But if you're like an old school film user and you know the difference between spot metering and evaluated metering and center weighted metering, I will show you how to set it on this camera. I'll hit the I button here. And this in the middle of the bottom row here, that icon is to set the metering. Matrix metering is what I leave it in all the time personally. But you can also select from center weighted metering and spot metering. That's where those two options are. But again, this camera has a great exposure system, and what I recommend everybody do is use matrix metering and then use exposure compensation if you need to adjust the exposure from that point. This camera has a built-in flash. And if you have this in the full auto mode, the flash will just pop up and fire without you doing anything. But if you switch into one of the creative modes like program mode or aperture priority mode, you'll have to manually activate it. And to do that, you'll just push this flash button here, right to the left of the flash, and it will pop up. And when it's up, it will fire no matter what you do. If you don't want it to fire, just physically push it back down and it'll snap into place. So as I pop it up here, you can see it's firing a flash. If that ends up being too bright for you, you can use flash exposure compensation. Flash exposure compensation allows you to dial up or down the amount of flash output. So here's where it's most useful. You'll take a picture with the flash and everybody will be blinded and their faces will be completely blown out and you'll think, that's too much flash. You can turn it down. I almost always have it dialed down. I'll hit the I button here and then I'll scroll over to this icon, flash compensation. I'll hit that and now I can dial it down, usually like -1.3 is a good setting. So with that dialed in, when I take a picture, it's going to output 1.3 stops less light. Each stop is a doubling or a halving of light. So -1 stops would be half the light. So -1.3 is a little less than half the light. Flash exposure compensation, it's useful. White balance, like metering, is something that I recommend people not ever think about. Especially if you're shooting RAW, you can always change the right white balance later, even if you screw it up, and there will be absolutely no penalty. If you are shooting JPEG and you get pictures that are a little too yellow or a little too blue or a little too green or a little too purple, the problem is white balance. And the camera, like your eye and your brain, automatically set the white balance based on the lights you have in the room, but sometimes it can guess wrong. If you decide that you want to manually change the white balance, you'll hit that I button again and you'll select this option. See, it says WB. I'll push that. And now I can select from sort of obvious icons here. Like the light bulb there is for incandescent light. There's another icon here for shade. or a cloudy day, but I almost always just select auto white balance. Let's talk about how to record video on this camera. It's pretty easy. To record video, you'll hit the live view button here, turn on live view, and then you'll just hit the record button here. You can still kind of focus while you're recording, but if you do refocus during the recording, the focusing isn't smooth or cinematic. It can kind of hunt around and be a little jerky, so it won't be pleasant to watch back. And for that reason, I always recommend focusing first, locking your focus in, and then starting to record. It doesn't quite work as smoothly as a dedicated camcorder does, but it will track something. It will try to track something while you're recording video. And that's basically all you need to know to record basic video with this thing. It will record up to half an hour and then it will shut off. You do have a couple of options that you can configure. So I'll hit the menu button here, and on the camera icon, I'll scroll down to page 3, and you'll see an option for movie settings, the last option there. So I'll hit OK. And you know, there are a couple of things you might want to set, like frame size, frame rate. I can scroll over here and select something different, but the default of 1920 by 1080 at 60p is what I prefer. Now, most TV you watch is recorded at 30p in the US, or played back at 30p in the US, and in European countries which use what they call PAL, it'll be at basically 24 frames a second. 60p captures twice as many frames as US television standards do, which provides for smoother movement. Everything just seems smoother and more lifelike, and for that reason I love it. If you get into editing your video, you could also record in 60p, play back in 30p, and that will give you the option to have nice and smooth slow motion. So it's kind of like a high-speed option. And it never really hurts to record in 60p. There's not much of a penalty, except the file sizes are a little bit bigger. So for that reason, I pretty much just leave it at 60p. The other option you might change is the microphone. If you do hook up an external microphone and you're not using the in-camera microphone, scroll down to microphone, and instead of auto sensitivity, set it to manual sensitivity, and then have the person give you a mic check. And if you see them like peaking, see how it's almost peaking there? You want to just dial it down a little bit until what I like to see is just the levels occasionally getting into the yellow. So I'll have the person talk as loud as they're going to talk. And if it goes like that, just getting into the yellow, they're probably good. You just want to set it to a point where it's not peaking on a regular basis, or else it'll sound a little crackly. If you want to make a time lapse, you can use this camera. It has a built-in interval timer. So to turn on the interval timer, you'll hit the menu button here. It's also with the camera icon on the third page of that, you'll see time-lapse movie. So I'll select that, and now I have a bunch of options I can set. I'll set the interval, which is how often it will take a picture. You can see by default it's set to take a picture every 5 seconds, but I could make it 1 minute and 5 seconds, or I can make it take a picture every 1 second, for example. So you'll set that, and then you'll click OK. And then shooting time is going to be the duration of your time lapse. So by default it's set to 25 minutes, but I can make it go to 1 hour and 25 minutes. And you can see it's showing you these settings down here. It's shooting for 1 hour and 25 minutes every 1 second. Exposure smoothing is a good thing to leave on if you're going to be stitching these pictures together into a time-lapse video later. And when I'm ready, I'll scroll up and I'll hit start. And then it's thinking. Now it's taking a picture every second. If I want to stop it, I'll just click OK. Now, you might have heard that it started to buffer there. It wasn't able to keep up with that 1 second interval time. That's because I'm shooting RAW to a fairly slow memory card. That might be something to think about, but as long as you're not taking pictures that frequently, it shouldn't ever be a problem. Do make sure your memory card has enough space to capture all those pictures, because it would be a pain to wait half an hour for the time lapse and then realize your camera filled up after 30 minutes. Mirror lockup is a technique I discuss in Stunning Digital Photography, and you can do a manual mirror lockup in this camera, but the easiest thing to do to lock the mirror up is just to hit that live view button. When you take a picture and you're using the viewfinder, what happens is you can see the mirror there flips out of the way. And the process of flipping out of the way shakes the camera just a tiny bit. So the reason mirror lockup exists is to eliminate that shake. And with mirror lockup, you'll move that mirror out of the way, then you'll take the picture. So you can get just a little bit steadier pictures when you're using a tripod. It's only useful really for macro photography, sometimes for landscape photography. But again, on this particular camera, I would just suggest you use live view instead of worrying about mirror lockup. So if you see it discussed, just know, just use live view instead. Now we're going to talk about how to get a wireless connection to your phone using Nikon Snapbridge. This is terribly useful if you're on vacation and you want to post a picture on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. It lets you get and share real pictures taken with a real camera instead of just using smartphone pictures. And the first step here is going to be to install the Nikon Snapbridge app. It's available for both iOS, like iPhones, and Android phones. So you'll go into your store and you'll search for Snapbridge. And you might see a couple of different options. You don't want the Snapbridge 360 171, you want just regular Snapbridge. And I already have it installed. You'll notice that it has 1.5 stars. That's a terrible, terrible rating. Most apps in the store have like 4 or 4.5 stars. There's a reason for that. Snapbridge is not a great app. Nikon, they're not really like mobile app developers. I appreciate that they're doing something cool. Snapbridge, when it works great, but the app itself can be a little flaky. I'm going to show you how to use it, but be aware that it might screw up, and it's not your fault. It's Nikon's fault. And I hope they release future updates that improve the reliability of it. They certainly have the ability to do that. Again, Snapbridge does often work, and when it works great. Once you have the app installed, you'll turn your camera on, and then you'll need to turn on Snapbridge. So to do that, you're going to go down to the wrench icon here, and this is not very intuitive. You'll scroll all the way down to the third page, and you'll see Connect to Smart Device. So I'll select that, and you can see it brings up the Snapbridge thing. So use Snapbridge, and we'll click OK to set. It's thinking for a little bit. Now you'll notice it says with NFC devices, you can just touch the camera to the smart device. The NFC is over here. So if you have an Android phone that supports NFC, no iPhone support it yet, you can tap it against there and maybe it will work. Though I was an Android user for the longest time, and I found that NFC like almost never worked with these cameras. So whether or not you have NFC, the other option you have is to just click OK. It says just click OK. Okay, so we skipped the NFC part, and now the camera is waiting for me to connect to the phone. You'll see its little name there, D5600 something. So what I'm going to do is pull up my phone here, and you can see my phone has found the D5600. So I'm going to select that. It's connecting to the camera. Okay, select an accessory. I'll select that again. Bluetooth pairing request. I'll select pair to allow that to happen. Okay, so now the camera is showing me an auth code. It says confirm that you're doing this and that it's not somebody hacking your phone, so I'll click OK. Establishing connection. Great. So now I've successfully connected to the camera and my phone. That's a good idea. The app is prompting me to sign up for a Nikon ID, and you don't actually need to do that. So I'm just going to click sign up later. You can sign up if you want. Welcome to Snapbridge. It just talks you through a couple of things that you can do. And so let's get started. Snapbridge has 2 different modes. Bluetooth is used for transferring pictures in the background. Bluetooth is a very low power, but also low bandwidth wireless connection, so it can just stay connected all the time. It's low power compared to Wi-Fi, but it will still burn through the batteries on your camera and your phone a little bit quicker. So you probably only want to use it when you're actively shooting. Wi-Fi is faster, and you can use it to deliberately transfer pictures when you're ready. But with Bluetooth, the pictures will just be waiting for you. So you can take a picture on your camera, and then the next time you pull up Instagram, they'll just be waiting. That's so convenient. I love that. Instead of having to manually think I need to fire up the Wi-Fi connection and browse my pictures, it's better. So it's telling me about Wi-Fi, and I'll click OK. I have to allow it to access my picture gallery and such. Now we need to set up Snapbridge. You can see auto download is set to paused, so I'm going to select that and then turn auto download on. I get two options, either 2 megapixel pictures or original size. By default, the way Snapbridge works is once you turn on auto download, it will send pictures to your smartphone, but they're shrunk from the original 24 megapixels down to 2 megapixels. So each megapixel is the amount, it's the number of dots. Like 2 megapixels is 2 million dots. 24 megapixels is 24 million dots. As you can imagine, shrinking down from 24 million dots to 2 million dots greatly reduces the overall sharpness of the image. But 2 megapixels is probably going to be enough for Facebook, Instagram, that kind of thing. Like, most people don't complain. If you want the full-sized image, you can choose original size. But those original size pictures take a long time to transfer. Like, it can be more than a minute to transfer it over Bluetooth. So 2 megapixels ensures that the pictures are kind of always waiting for you, and original size will give you sharper pictures, but it might never get caught up. It can just be constantly trying to send pictures back to your smartphone if you're taking pictures quickly. So for the most part, for this and for its casual use of sharing pictures quickly, I stick with the 2 megapixel option. Nikon image space auto upload, you don't ever have any reason to use that. Upload location. This option allows your phone to use its GPS to collect your location, and then it can tag your pictures with that location. I like that option a lot. If you're concerned about privacy, if you don't want people to know where you are, then you might want to leave that off. But I like to turn it on because it will tell people where I am when I'm taking pictures. And it also means if I get a good landscape picture, I can look up the location and go back to it. With that location data, you can pull it into Adobe Lightroom and actually see where your pictures were taken on a map. The last option here, synchronize clock, sets the clock in your camera based on the accurate clock in your phone. So that's a good thing to have on. To view the pictures you've taken, you can either just the easiest way is just to go into any app like Instagram, and then you can see recent pictures that you've taken in your library here. If you have the automatic transfer working correctly, you'll take a picture with your camera and it will appear in your phone's gallery automatically. You don't have to open up the Snapbridge app. You can just go right into Instagram or Facebook and you'll see the pictures there in your gallery. Some troubleshooting tips. You have to be shooting JPEG files. It will not automatically transfer RAW files. So either shoot JPEG only or shoot RAW plus JPEG. Either one will work okay. If you run into problems like it's simply not working, the process I usually go through is to go into, unpair them from the Snapbridge app, remove the pairing in the Bluetooth settings on my iPhone, and then restart both the phone and the camera by taking the battery out of the camera and letting it sit for a little bit and then powering it back up. You can also uninstall and reinstall the Snapbridge app, and sometimes that will help too. So you kind of go through this whole process of clearing out all your settings, then trying everything again. I can't explain why I can follow the exact same process multiple times and it will fail sometimes and work other times. But that is the experience. Sometimes it's just an unreliable kind of flaky connection. It is incredibly complex, and when it does work, you'll find it can be really good, but getting there can be frustrating. So don't set it up before you leave on vacation. Besides that sort of Bluetooth automatic transfer, there's a second mode which uses Wi-Fi, and I find the Wi-Fi mode to be more reliable. To connect via Wi-Fi with an Android phone, you can just fire up the Snapbridge app and then hit the camera thing here, and then go into remote photography. If you are using Android, generally it will automatically connect to the correct Wi-Fi network for you. It'll start, if you have that Bluetooth connection established, it'll even start Wi-Fi on your camera for you, so the connection's more automatic. If you have an iPhone, you'll have to, it's telling you this here, but you'll have to manually connect to the Wi-Fi network created by your phone. So I'll hit the settings here and I'll go up to Wi-Fi. And I'll look for this network that's created by my phone. It's D5600 something. So I'll select that. And the first time you do this, it's going to prompt you for a password. The Wi-Fi password is Nikon D5600 in all uppercase. If you forget that, you can hit the menu button here, go to, under the wrench icon, go down to Wi-Fi, scroll to the right, select current settings, and you'll see down here, password, Nikon D5600. I just closed it. Nikon D5600. Remember, it has to be in all caps. So you'll connect to the Nikon D5600 network here. Now that you're in remote control mode, you can see through the camera. So wait, what if I zoom in here? Oh, there's Justin, our cameraman. I can touch the screen to focus and hit the shutter to take a picture. And you can see it's providing some information like the shutter speed and aperture. If you want to change those, you still need to do that from the camera. It does work in horizontal mode here just to let you fill up the screen a little bit better. There are a couple of settings you can change by hitting the gear icon here. You can see it's still downloading only a 2 megapixel picture. So if I want to get the full size, high resolution image, I would switch to original size. It's using Wi-Fi now, so it shouldn't be that slow. You also have the option of turning on self timer there. When you're ready to close out, you can hit the X in the upper left corner. Another option here is to download selected photos. And just like with remote photography, it needs to turn on Wi-Fi. So I'm going to switch from Bluetooth to Wi-Fi by clicking yes. Now it talks via Bluetooth to the camera to say, hey, we're going to browse photos over Wi-Fi now. So it's telling the camera to turn on Wi-Fi. Okay, so now it says Wi-Fi has been enabled on the camera, but because this is an iPhone, I need to manually connect to that Wi-Fi network. On an Android phone, it would probably automatically wire that up for you. So I'll click go and it would take me into the settings. Go back. Wi-Fi. And then that D5600 network. This also disconnects me from the internet now, so I wouldn't be able to immediately share something on Instagram, for example, until I disconnected from the camera. So I'll switch back to Snapbridge by tapping the home button on my phone twice. So now what it's doing is it's browsing all the photos, so it's going to load up my thumbnails. So here we can see the picture I just took of Justin, and I can hit download here to get the full resolution version or the 2 megapixel version, whichever size I want. And you can see it also gives you the option to download videos if you want to. As with the auto download, you cannot transfer RAW files. You can only transfer JPEG files. But one bit of good news, if you do take a RAW picture, I'll just switch it into RAW and take a picture real quick. If you do take a RAW picture, you can convert it into a JPEG picture. So I'm reviewing this RAW file. You can see it says RAW there. I'll hit the I button here and then go into Retouch, RAW processing, and then I will just export it as with the normal JPEG quality setting. And scroll it to EXE and click OK, and that will save it as a JPEG file. So now, that nice picture of extension tubes, I can go back up here, and if I scroll to the top, I'll have to close out of it and then get back into it. And there it is, a JPEG file converted from our in-camera RAW file without having to use a computer and available in full resolution. Okay, so Snapbridge can work really easily, and some of you followed those steps and it worked perfectly, and others of you had real problems like we did here in the studio. We actually probably spent an hour just getting it to work and troubleshooting different things and going through the troubleshooting steps that I talked about. So it really can be frustrating, and for many of you, the Wi-Fi might work better than the Bluetooth, the transfer photos from the camera using Wi-Fi. It's faster and maybe a little bit more reliable. Either way, I'm keeping my fingers crossed that maybe Nikon will give us an update. Let's talk about how to format a memory card. The memory card in your camera, revealed underneath this little slot here, it's your digital film, and if you take enough pictures, you will eventually fill it up. At that point, make sure you unload those pictures onto a computer, back those pictures up, and then you can reuse the card by formatting it. To format the card, you'll hit the menu button here. You go over to the wrench icon, and then on the very first page, I'm just going to scroll up back to the front. Very first option, format memory card. So I'll scroll to the right to select that, and it's going to prompt me, all images on the memory card will be deleted. Is that okay? I'll select yes, and then I'll click OK. It formats it. I can reuse it. Now I have a blank slate again. If you accidentally formatted it and you didn't mean to, you can unformat it by using a free tool called PhotoRec. Visit stp.io/PhotoRec. Chapter 5 in Stunning Digital Photography has a video showing you how to use it. Either way, do not pay for a photo recovery tool. This one's free and it works great. Let's talk about how to customize the buttons. After you've been using your camera for maybe a month or so, you realize you use some options more often than others, and maybe you get tired of going through the menus for something. You can customize what each of the different buttons do. To do that, you'll hit the menu button and then go into the pencil icon down to F, Controls, and now you can see you can customize this FN button, which is this button over here, FN. You can assign the AEL, AFL button, which we use for AF on. You can also assign various touch functions. Or if you can also reverse the dial rotation, which I've never felt the urge to do, but if that feels backwards to you, you can reverse it from there. Another option that I hope everybody will change is the beep. I find the beeping of the camera to confirm focus to be annoying. It shows you green when it gets stuff in focus, so you really don't need it, and it does ruins the discretion of your photography. Everybody will look to see what you're taking a picture of. So I suggest everybody turn that off. Here on page 1, under the wrench icon, scroll down, you'll see beep options. Beep on off, we're just going to set that to off. You really don't need it. Your smartphone probably doesn't beep every time you do something. If you find yourself getting lost as you're looking for a particular item in the menus, there's a really helpful recent menu items here. The last menu item here is recent settings, and this just shows you all the settings that you've used most recently. So the second time you go to change something, you don't have to go digging through the menus for it. You can just find it right there. Now let's talk about some accessories that you might want to get for your camera. The first, of course, is some good software, because you'll probably be taking a lot of pictures and you'll need to organize those pictures. Pretty much what everybody uses, amateur and pro, is Adobe Lightroom. I suggest getting the Creative Cloud deal, which is usually it's $10 a month. It depends on where in the world you are. And that includes Photoshop. It's still the best deal, and it keeps you up to date. So you'll get all the updates for free. You can also buy it outright, but they leave out a few features and you don't get free updates. So you do have the choice of buying it. It's like $100 and change. Go to stp.io/Adobe deal to check it out. And I have a book on Lightroom if that can help. As I mentioned earlier, I would definitely get a second battery for this and keep it with you. We ran out of batteries just in the course of creating this tutorial. So you can run out of batteries fairly quickly, and it never hurts to have an extra. I also suggest getting a USB charger, because they're just easier to charge. A lot of airplanes and cars will have USB ports that you could use to charge your battery if you had that USB charger. If you want to get into macro photography, let me suggest some extension tubes. Extension tubes, what they do is they move the lens a little bit further away from the camera than it would normally be. So let me separate these extension tubes. Extension tubes are just hollow tubes. They look like a lens, but there's no optics in there. You'll put them on your camera, and then you'll put your lens on the extension tube. So now it's going between the lens and the camera, and what this will do is let me focus much more closely than I would be able to otherwise. For detailed information about using extension tubes, check out chapter 12 of my book, Stunning Digital Photography, where I cover macro photography. Anyway, these extension tubes are a remarkably inexpensive way to get into macro and super close-up photography, and it's a great like rainy day project. You might also want a remote shutter trigger. I did suggest a couple of ways to get around that, like using a 2-second delay and using the time mode. The remote shutter trigger can still be useful for times when you don't want to shake the camera, but you also don't want to wait 2 seconds. So if you do want to get one, don't get the Nikon one. Just pick up one that looks like this. If you don't find one designed for the D5600, it can be designed for like a D5500 or a D5300. They use the same connector. Most of the entry-level Nikons use the same connector. These generic ones are cheaper than the Nikon ones, and they work just great. If you got the kit with the 18-55 lens, that's a good and serviceable lens. But there's another kit lens, which is the 18-140, and it's a lot more versatile. This 18-140 lens allows you to zoom in much closer, meaning it's much better at things like sports and wildlife and any kind of long distance work. And I like it just for general travel stuff. At the long end at 140, you can even get decent portraits with pretty good background blur. So check it out at that link, sdp.io/n140. If you decide you want the sharpest pictures possible, those kit lenses just aren't that sharp. So you can get detailed pictures, but they're not going to be worthy of that 24 megapixel sensor you have. One lens that will produce professional levels of sharpness for making great sharp big prints is the Sigma 18-35 f1.8 lens. It's an absolutely stellar pro-grade lens. It's big and heavy. You'll be shocked when you pick it up, but it's fantastic in low light and produces incredibly sharp results. Pick it up at sdp.io/s35n. If you get into landscape photography or you need a super wide angle lens, maybe because you're traveling through those narrow European streets, pick up the 10-24 millimeter lens by Nikon. You can use the link here, sdp.io/n1024. If you get into portraiture, this lens is good, the 18-140, but a better lens for producing great background blur is the Sigma 50-100 f1.8 lens. This, like that other Sigma lens, produces pro-grade, super sharp results. Pick it up at sdp.io/s100. Be careful with the focusing. It can be a little challenging to focus it, but when you do get it in focus, it works absolutely fantastically. If you're into more long-range sports, maybe shooting your kid's soccer game from the sidelines, check out the Tamron 70-200 f2.8. It's incredibly sharp, and you have just a lot of reach for faraway subjects. Pick it up at sdp.io/t200. If you get into wildlife, this is my favorite lens in the Nikon lineup. For that, it's the Nikon 200-500. It's huge and it's kind of expensive, but especially with this D5500, you can get just stellar results at the long end. Pick it up at sdp.io/n500. If you're going to be making prints in the United States, we have a whole comparison of like a dozen different print providers where you send them your picture online and they mail you a physical print, so you don't have to have a printer. Check that comparison out at sdp.io/print, or I can just tell you we decided we liked MPix the best. That's not MPix, MPIX. It's not a sponsorship. It's who we use. We like them, and they turned out to be the best. A tripod is a necessity for things like self-portraits and for night photography, macro photography, and you can spend a lot on a tripod. It's easy to spend $500 on a tripod. I suggest people start out with an inexpensive $50 tripod, this Dolica tripod. Pick it up at sdp.io/tripod1. Even if you later end up getting a higher end tripod, it's still nice to have that kind of lightweight tripod for travel and stuff. If you don't mind spending a few more bucks, my favorite travel tripod is the Manfrotto Be-Free. Check it out at that link. They're expensive, but it's super lightweight. It folds up really small so it can fit into your bag. It's not a pain to carry with you everywhere. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to see more free videos. We have lots of fun videos, lots of informative and educational videos, and every Thursday at 5 o'clock Eastern Time, we review your pictures live. We'll look at your pictures when you send them in and give you feedback and help answer questions, that kind of thing. Thanks so much for watching. Also, check out my books, Stunning Digital Photography, my books on Lightroom and Photoshop, and of course, my photography buying guide, which answers all your gear questions. You can go to sdp.io/store, where we ship worldwide, or just go to Amazon. There you can see lots of independent reviews and find out what other people think, and so you don't have to trust my opinion, right? Thanks so much. Any questions, ask in the comments down below. Share with your friends. Bye.